Recovered picked feeds from breached Imperial defense lines rarely preserve clean images of the organism before impact. Most recordings begin with dust displacement, Auspex distortion, and the failure of range markers as lesser Tyranid organisms cross the foreground in dense numbers. The larger silhouette usually appears later, moving behind the swarm until it reaches the final approach distance. At that point, the recording becomes more useful to the Mergos biologist than to battlefield command, because the creature's structure can be measured against bunker walls, armoured vehicles and hab-block foundations moments before contact. The organism does not advance like an animal searching for prey. It advances like a siege implement given muscle, instinct and directed hunger. Its mass is concentrated forward. Its head and thorax are protected by layered chitin. Its limbs are arranged for impact traction and close destruction. When viewed through surviving fragments of battlefield data, it becomes clear that the creature is not a natural predator adapted for war by circumstance. It is war made biological. It is the Tyranid Carnifex. The origins of the Carnifex are inseparable from the wider development of the Tyranid species as a galactic predator. The Tyranids do not manufacture machines in the Imperial sense. They do not design armoured vehicles through forged temples, assembly lines, sacred templates, or industrial labour. Their tools are living organisms grown for specific functions, then altered according to battlefield need. Every Tyranid bioform exists as part of a larger process of adaptation. It is consumed, tested, refined, and redeployed through the will of the Hive Mind. Within that system, the Carnifex occupies the role that many human military cultures would assign to a main battle tank, an assault engine, or a shock breakthrough unit. The earliest Imperial encounters with creatures matching the Carnifex profile occurred during the first major Tyranid wars against the Imperium, when the full scale of the extragalactic invasion was still poorly understood. At first, many Imperial commanders interpreted the largest Tyranid organisms as rare apex beasts directing or supporting the swarm. This assessment was incomplete. The Carnifex was not a commander organism in the same sense as a hive tyrant, nor was it merely a large predator. Its behaviour showed repeated evidence of battlefield specialisation. It was deployed where defensive walls had to be broken, armoured formations had to be disrupted, and infantry morale had to collapse under direct physical pressure. The construction of the Carnifex begins with the Tyranid method of biological production. The Hive Mind stores genetic information gathered from countless consumed worlds, then expresses that information through spawning chambers, gestation pools, and organic growth systems within the hive fleet. The Carnifex is not built from metal, ceramic plating, or promethium engines. It is grown from biomass. Its skeleton, muscles, armour, sensory systems, and weapons are shaped by evolutionary command rather than mechanical assembly. The result is a creature that can be produced in broods when sufficient biomass and strategic need align. Its body is massive by the standards of most battlefield organisms. While exact dimensions vary between strains and biomorph configurations, the Carnifex is consistently described as a hulking, monstrous creature, large enough to challenge armoured vehicles directly and powerful enough to breach fortified positions through force. Its frame is compact compared to the taller and more specialised synapse creatures of the Tyranid swarm, but its density is one of its defining traits. The torso is heavily reinforced. The legs are built for driving mass forward across broken terrain. The arms can be adapted into scything talons, crushing claws, or organic ranged weapons depending on the intended deployment role. The Carnifex's development reflects a central principle of Tyranid warfare. A living weapon does not need one permanent form if the Hive Mind can alter the weapon before deployment. A Leman Russ battle tank may receive different sponsons or turret weapons, but it remains bound by the limits of machine construction. A Carnifex can be spawned with different biomorphs, different weapon symbiotes, different armour growths, and different combat instincts. This makes the creature difficult to classify with a single battlefield profile. One Carnifex may function as a battering ram, another may operate as a mobile gun beast, another may be developed to crush enemy armour or tear through fortified urban structures. The basic Carnifex form appears to have been refined through repeated contact with heavily defended worlds. Tyranid swarms can overwhelm lightly armed populations through numbers alone, but Imperial worlds rarely fall through simple overrun. Fortress walls, void-shielded facilities, armoured columns, orbital defence batteries, hive city gates, and underground command bunkers all create resistance points, where lesser organisms suffer heavy losses. The Carnifex exists to resolve those points of resistance. It gives the swarm a direct answer to the enemy's refusal to break. Its development also demonstrates the Hive Mind's preference for efficient terror. The Carnifex is not subtle. It is not designed to infiltrate. It does not depend on deception, silence, or surgical movement. Its arrival announces that the swarm has reached the stage where the enemy's physical defences must be smashed. For defenders, the sight of a Carnifex means that ammunition must be redirected away from the lesser organisms already flooding the line. Heavy weapons crews must choose between firing into the swarm or targeting the monstrous organism closing the distance. That choice is often fatal either way, which is precisely why the Carnifex has remained such a persistent battlefield form. The organism's construction is also notable because it integrates weapon and body without separation. A human vehicle carries a cannon. A Carnifex grows a weapon system as part of its own living structure, or bonds with a weapon symbiote that functions as an extension of the larger Tyranid ecology. Its talons, claws, tusks, bioplasma organs, venom cannons, devourers, and other possible biomorphs are not equipment in the normal military sense. They are organs, limbs, or living parasites directed toward combat output. This removes several weaknesses common to mechanical weapons. The Carnifex does not reload in a conventional manner, does not require fuel in the same sense as an engine, and does not separate cleanly from its armaments. This does not make the creature invincible. Its mass requires biomass investment. Its deployment is most effective when supported by the swarm. It can be isolated, delayed, wounded, or destroyed by coordinated heavy fire. But the cost required to stop it is often far greater than the defenders would prefer. Anti-armor weapons, massed plasma fire, melter weapons, Lascannon strikes, orbital support, and disciplined concentration of fire may be needed to bring down a single specimen. Even then, battlefield accounts frequently describe Carnifex organisms continuing to advance after injuries that would disable a mechanical vehicle or kill a lesser creature outright. The development of variant strains further indicates how extensively the Hive Mind has tested the Carnifex form. Some are configured for direct assault with paired scything talons, maximizing close-range killing efficiency against infantry and light vehicles. Others bear crushing claws capable of tearing open armoured hulls and breaking hardened structures. Gunbeast variants can carry heavy bioweapons, allowing them to advance with the swarm while projecting destructive firepower into enemy lines. Specialized strains such as the Screamer Killer emphasize close combat and bioplasma discharge, while Stonecrusher variants are associated with attacks against fortifications and armored targets. These variations are not separate species in a human taxonomic sense. They are expressions of the same Tyranid logic: identify resistance, grow the answer, consume the result. The Carnifex's construction also reveals the Tyranid approach to durability. Imperial armor depends on plating, angles, power systems, internal crew protection, and repair logistics. The Carnifex depends on dense chitin, redundant organs, rapid clotting, pain resistance, and the absence of fear. A damaged vehicle may stop because its engine fails, its crew dies, its tracks are severed, or its ammunition detonates. A wounded Carnifex remains dangerous as long as enough of its nervous and muscular systems continue to obey the Hive Mind's command. Even partial damage can fail to reduce its immediate threat if the creature has already reached striking distance. The most important stage in the Carnifex's development is not merely biological, it is doctrinal. The Hive Mind learned, through repeated wars, that many prey species place great confidence in hard defences. Walls, tanks, bunkers, sealed gates, and void ship corridors all create the belief that flesh can be stopped by engineered barriers. The Carnifex exists to disprove that belief at close range. It is the answer to the enemy's assumption that massed armour and fixed protection will buy enough time for command structures to survive. By the time Imperial scholars began assigning stable names and categories to the creature, the Carnifex had already become one of the most recognizable Tyranid bioforms in Imperial records. Its presence in a war zone indicated that the invasion had moved beyond probing attacks and swarm saturation. It meant that the Hive fleet was committing heavy biological assets to crush organized resistance. It meant that the defenders were no longer facing only claws, fangs, and numbers. They were facing a living siege organism bred to turn fortifications into wreckage and armoured vehicles into opened carcasses. The Carnifex therefore stands as one of the clearest examples of Tyranid construction and development. It is grown, not built. It is adapted, not standardized. It is deployed as a weapon, not as an individual creature with independent purpose. Its origin lies in the Hive Mind's endless conversion of consumed life into new forms of war. Its construction reflects the Tyranid mastery of biological engineering. Its development shows how the swarm learns from resistance and transforms that resistance into future vulnerability. At the beginning of an invasion, lesser organisms test the enemy. In the middle stages, synapse creatures direct the assault and feeding organisms harvest the dead. But when the Carnifex appears, the Tyranid war pattern becomes unmistakable. The swarm has found the barrier, the Hive Mind has selected the tool, the wall is no longer being studied, it is being removed. The Carnifex possesses one of the most physically recognizable body structures among all major Tyranid bioforms. Even among the vast anatomical diversity of the Hive fleets, its silhouette remains consistent enough that Imperial commanders frequently identify the organism before Auspex confirmation is complete. The creature's broad, armoured torso, low forward heavy stance, reinforced cranial structure and oversized forelimbs create an appearance that resembles a living battering engine more than a conventional predator. This is not accidental. Every major feature of the Carnifex exists to maximize battlefield penetration, survivability, and shock impact during frontal assault operations. Most Carnifex strains measure several meters in height at the shoulder, and significantly more when fully raised during combat movement. Weight estimates vary considerably depending on biomorph configuration and armor density, but battlefield analyses consistently place mature specimens within ranges comparable to heavily armored military vehicles. Some Mechanicus observers have noted that the creature's sheer density appears disproportionate to its visible mass, suggesting that portions of its skeletal and muscular systems are reinforced beyond the norms of naturally evolved life. The Carnifex does not merely appear large, it behaves as an object of tremendous momentum. Its exterior is dominated by layered chitin armor plating. These plates overlap across the head, shoulders, thorax, and upper limbs in thick segmented formations capable of deflecting or dispersing significant ballistic and energy-based impacts. Unlike rigid metal armor, the Carnifex chitin possesses a degree of biological flexibility, allowing it to absorb kinetic force without catastrophic structural failure. Damage that would crack conventional plating may instead spread across several layers of organic armor. Smaller caliber weapons often prove ineffective unless concentrated against joints, sensory organs, or already weakened sections of the body. The cranial structure of the Carnifex is especially reinforced. The head is low and broad, protected by heavy frontal plating designed to absorb incoming fire during direct charges. Horn structures and tusk-like protrusions are common among many strains. These are not decorative evolutionary traits. They serve practical combat functions during close assaults by helping the creature breach fortifications, overturn vehicles, or impale defenders during momentum-driven impacts. Some observed specimens possess enlarged cranial ridges thick enough to survive direct collisions with ferrocrete walls at full speed. The creature's limbs are among its most distinctive biological weapons. The primary forelimbs are typically configured into one of several offensive biomorph arrangements, depending on battlefield role. Scything talons remain among the most common. These elongated, bladed appendages are capable of tearing through infantry formations, armoured personnel carriers, and defensive barricades with rapid, sweeping strikes. The blades themselves are composed of hardened biological material dense enough to shear through plasteel and ceramite under sufficient force. Crushing claw variants represent a different approach to combat specialization. These oversized limbs sacrifice some attack speed in exchange for overwhelming striking power. A Carnifex equipped with crushing claws is often deployed against heavily fortified positions or armored targets where direct penetrative force is preferred over repeated slashing attacks. Reports from armored regiments describe Carnifexes physically rupturing battle tank hulls through repeated impacts against weak structural points such as turret rings, engine compartments, or track assemblies. Despite its immense size, the Carnifex is not considered slow by battlefield standards. Its movement profile is based on aggressive acceleration and momentum generation rather than sustained pursuit. The creature's rear limbs are heavily muscled and adapted for traction across unstable terrain. Mud, rubble, crater fields, urban debris, and trench systems that would immobilize conventional vehicles often fail to significantly delay a charging Carnifex. Its low center of gravity and distributed body weight allow it to maintain balance even while sustaining heavy impacts. One of the organism's most dangerous characteristics is its ability to continue functioning despite catastrophic injury. The Carnifex possesses extensive biological redundancy throughout its internal systems. Multiple secondary organs support circulation and respiration. Dense muscle layering protects vital structures beneath armor plating. Its nervous system appears resistant to pain shock and trauma responses that would disable ordinary creatures. Numerous battlefield recordings describe Carnifex organisms continuing to advance despite limb damage, partial cranial penetration, or massive tissue loss. This resilience is enhanced further by the Tyranid capacity for adaptive evolution. Hive fleets encountering repeated resistance from specific weapon types have demonstrated the ability to spawn Carnifex strains with modified defensive characteristics. Additional armor growths, hardened chitin density, toxin resistance, thermal tolerance, and enhanced regenerative capabilities have all been documented. Imperial tacticians have repeatedly noted that strategies effective against one hive fleet may perform poorly against another due to these ongoing biological refinements. The Carnifex offensive capabilities extend beyond physical assault. Many strains incorporate range bioweapons integrated directly into the creature's anatomy. These weapon symbiotes are living organisms bonded to the Carnifex through the Tyranid biological network. Unlike manufactured firearms, the weapons are partially alive, sustained through the host organism's metabolism, and directed by instinctive neural coordination. The most recognizable ranged variant is the venom cannon. This bioweapon launches dense organic projectiles accelerated through muscular contraction and internal pressure systems. The projectiles possess sufficient force to threaten armored vehicles, defensive emplacements, and infantry concentrations. While Imperial anti-tank weaponry relies on explosive charges or directed energy, the venom cannon functions more like a biological artillery organ. Impacts are often accompanied by corrosive compounds and secondary fragmentation effects generated by hardened biomatter. Barbed stranglers represent another commonly observed weapon configuration. These organisms launch seed-like ammunition masses that erupt into razor-sharp biological tendrils upon impact. Infantry formations caught within the blast radius may become entangled, shredded, or immobilized before the advancing swarm closes distance. The weapon is particularly effective against defensive trenches and urban strongpoints, where personnel density is high. Devourer symbiotes operate through extremely high-volume organic projectile discharge. Flesh-borer organisms and parasitic ammunition masses are accelerated toward targets in sustained volleys, capable of stripping exposed infantry and damaging lighter vehicles through repeated biological penetration. Some Carnifex strains equipped with twin-linked devourers have demonstrated rates of fire dense enough to overwhelm entrenched infantry before physical engagement even begins. Bioplasma projection is another distinctive offensive capability associated with several Carnifex variants, particularly the Screamer Killer strain. Specialized internal organs generate highly volatile, energy-rich biological matter, expelled as concentrated plasma discharges during close-range engagements. These blasts are capable of liquefying infantry, damaging armoured hulls and destabilising defensive lines immediately before physical impact occurs. Unlike Imperial plasma technology, which depends on contained reactor systems and cooling assemblies, Tyranid bioplasma is generated through organic metabolic processes. The Screamer Killer strain itself became one of the earliest widely feared Carnifex variants due to its extreme assault specialization. This organism emphasizes direct close-quarters destruction through enlarged talons, reinforced musculature, and aggressive neural behavior patterns. Battlefield records indicate that Screamer Killers frequently operate at the forefront of swarm breakthroughs, targeting concentrated infantry positions and armoured resistance points, with minimal regard for incoming fire. The Thornback variant demonstrates another layer of Carnifex adaptation. Enlarged dorsal armour growths, spine protrusions, and reinforced frontal plating allow these strains to operate within dense swarm formations while resisting concentrated infantry attacks. Some Thornback organisms have been observed physically scattering infantry units through sheer mass and intimidation before engaging targets directly. Stonecrusher Carnifex strains are particularly associated with siege operations and urban assaults. Their specialized claws, reinforced exoskeletal density, and adapted skeletal structure allow them to dismantle fortified structures with extraordinary efficiency. During Tyranid invasions involving hive cities or subterranean strongholds, Stonecrushers are often deployed against bunker entrances, shield generators, and armoured barriers where conventional swarm organisms would suffer excessive casualties. Defensively, the Carnifex benefits not only from armour and biological redundancy, but also from psychological warfare effects generated through its presence. Human defenders frequently interpret the creature as unstoppable due to its size and visible resistance to injury. Reports from Astra Militarum survivors describe morale collapse occurring after repeated heavy weapon strikes fail to immediately halt a charging Carnifex. This effect becomes especially severe when multiple Carnifex organisms advance simultaneously within the larger Tyranid assault wave. Its sensory systems also contribute significantly to battlefield efficiency. Though not considered a synapse creature itself, the Carnifex operates under the guidance of the Hive Mind through the Tyranid synaptic network. This allows it to function with coordinated aggression rather than animalistic unpredictability. It does not panic, hesitate, or retreat unless tactical withdrawal serves the greater swarm objective. The creature reacts with machine-like precision despite being entirely organic. The Carnifex's metabolic structure also supports prolonged battlefield operations. Tyranid organisms consume biomass aggressively after engagements, and Carnifex strains appear capable of sustaining combat effectiveness even under significant environmental stress. Toxic atmospheres, radiation exposure, low visibility conditions, and unstable terrain rarely prevent deployment. Some hive fleets have produced Carnifex strains specifically adapted for extreme planetary conditions, including frozen wastelands, ash deserts, and industrial death worlds. Despite these strengths, the Carnifex is not without vulnerabilities. Concentrated heavy weapons fire remains effective when properly coordinated. Mobility suppression through terrain manipulation, focused artillery strikes, melter weapon saturation, and aerial bombardment can neutralize isolated specimens. Large targets naturally attract attention from anti-armor units, and unsupported Carnifex organisms may eventually be overwhelmed through sustained firepower. However, the Tyranid invasion doctrine rarely deploys the Carnifex in isolation. Its greatest effectiveness emerges when integrated into the broader swarm ecosystem. Lesser organisms screen its advance. Synapse creatures maintain coordination. Gargoyles and aerial bioforms disrupt enemy firing positions. While defenders concentrate resources against the Carnifex itself, the surrounding swarm closes distance from every direction. This combined pressure transforms the Carnifex from a dangerous creature into a battlefield anchor around which entire Tyranid assaults can pivot. The organism therefore represents more than brute force alone. Its specifications, offensive systems, and defensive traits reflect a carefully refined biological war doctrine developed across countless consumed civilizations. Every adaptation serves a military purpose. Every mutation answers a resistance pattern previously encountered by the Hive Mind. The Carnifex is not simply large because Tyranids favour monstrous organisms. It is large because somewhere beyond the galaxy, the Hive Mind learned that prey species eventually build walls, tanks and fortresses strong enough to resist lesser predators. The Carnifex was created to make those defences irrelevant. Unlike the armoured vehicles and war engines employed by most major civilizations of the galaxy, the Carnifex possesses no pilot compartment, command throne, crew station, or mechanical control interface. It does not require operators in the conventional sense because the organism itself is both weapon and vehicle simultaneously. The Carnifex is alive in totality. Its armour, weapons, movement systems, sensory organs, and combat instincts are integrated into a single biological entity directed through the synaptic influence of the Tyranid Hive Mind. This distinction is critical to understanding the Carnifex battlefield role. Imperial tank crews require training, coordination, maintenance discipline, ammunition supply chains, fuel logistics, replacement parts, and communication support. Even the most advanced Adeptus Mechanicus war machines depend on human or cybernetic operators capable of interpreting battlefield conditions and responding to command structures. The Carnifex bypasses nearly all such limitations. It does not need morale conditioning, rest rotations, or tactical briefing. The organism is born with its combat role already embedded within its biological and instinctive structure. Though it lacks a traditional crew, the Carnifex is not independent in the same sense as a wild predator. It functions as a component of the larger Tyranid synaptic ecosystem. Hive tyrants, Tyranid warriors, Norn queens, and other synapse organisms exert command influence across the swarm through psychic transmission. Within this network, the Carnifex operates as a directed assault organism capable of receiving battlefield intent without verbal communication or technological relay systems. This relationship between synapse command and individual bioform behavior explains much of the Carnifex's combat efficiency. The creature does not require visual confirmation to understand broad swarm objectives. It advances toward resistance points selected by the Hive Mind itself. Defensive gun emplacements, armoured spearheads, fortress entrances, and heavily populated firing lines consistently attract Carnifex assaults because the synaptic network recognizes those positions as obstacles to biomass acquisition. Even when isolated temporarily from nearby synapse creatures, the Carnifex often continues its last assigned objective with relentless persistence. Its internal sensory systems further reduce the need for external coordination. The organism possesses acute environmental awareness through a combination of visual, chemical, vibrational, and instinctive threat detection mechanisms. Some battlefield observers have noted that Carnifex strains appear capable of identifying armoured targets or heavy weapon positions before direct line-of-sight exposure occurs. Whether this behaviour stems from sensory adaptation, synaptic prediction, or pheromonal battlefield communication remains uncertain, but the effect is consistent across multiple Tyranid invasions. The Carnifex's use case within Tyranid warfare is exceptionally broad because the creature exists as a modular biological platform rather than a fixed combat design. Different strains fulfill different operational requirements depending on planetary resistance patterns and hive fleet strategy. Despite these variations, the organism's core battlefield purpose remains consistent: the application of overwhelming force against hardened opposition. The most common deployment role is direct assault breakthrough. During planetary invasions, Tyranid swarms often saturate enemy lines with endless waves of gaunts, gargoyles, and lesser organisms. These attacks force defenders into sustained firing patterns that gradually exhaust ammunition reserves and firing discipline. Once resistance hardens around defensive choke points, the Carnifex enters the engagement zone. Its task is not merely to kill enemy personnel, its task is to collapse the physical structure of resistance itself. Against trench systems, the Carnifex functions as a mobile breach engine. Defensive barriers are crushed beneath its weight. Reinforced firing positions are physically dismantled through claw strikes and frontal impacts. infantry concentrations attempting to hold fixed lines often discover that conventional cover ceases to matter once the organism reaches close range. Trenches become death traps rather than defensive assets because escape routes collapse under advancing Tyranid pressure. Urban warfare represents another environment where the Carnifex demonstrates extreme effectiveness. Hive cities, manufactorums, industrial districts and fortress complexes provide defenders with natural kill corridors and fortified firing angles. Smaller Tyranid organisms can suffer catastrophic losses attempting to cross open streets or breach sealed structures. The Carnifex solves this problem through raw durability and structural destruction capability. Walls are breached directly, barricades are overturned. Building foundations are destabilized through repeated impact force. Stonecrusher variants are especially suited for these operations. Reports from devastated hive worlds describe these strains tearing through ferrocrete bulkheads, collapsing bunker entrances, and creating breach corridors large enough for swarm organisms to flood interior sectors. In many cases, defenders initially mistake the sounds of approaching stonecrushers for industrial seismic activity due to the intensity of structural vibration generated during their advance. The Carnifex also serves an anti-armor role. Imperial armored formations rely heavily on coordinated movement, range advantage, and concentrated firepower to maintain battlefield control. Carnifex organisms disrupt these formations through direct physical aggression and environmental pressure. A charging Carnifex forces tank crews to reposition, split firing arcs, or retreat from optimal engagement positions. Even if destroyed before reaching contact range, the creature can create enough disruption for the surrounding swarm to close distance against weakened defensive cohesion. Certain bioweapon configurations enhance this anti-armor function further. Venom cannon strains can pressure vehicles at range while advancing. Crushing claw variants target structural weak points directly during melee engagement. Bioplasma discharges can overload exposed armor sections moments before physical impact. The Carnifex therefore occupies a battlefield role somewhere between heavy assault armor and siege artillery while remaining entirely biological. Jungle and Death World operations also favor the Carnifex due to its environmental resilience. The organism's movement system is not dependent on wheels, tracks, or stabilized suspension systems vulnerable to terrain hazards. Dense vegetation, unstable ground, toxic ecosystems, and collapsed infrastructure rarely prevent deployment. Tyranid invasions on Death Worlds frequently involve Carnifex strains adapted for extreme climates, where Imperial armor support becomes unreliable or impossible. The psychological use case of the Carnifex is equally important. Tyranid warfare consistently weaponizes terror through scale, momentum, and inevitability. Human defenders can rationalize casualties inflicted by distant artillery or unseen orbital strikes. The Carnifex creates a more immediate psychological effect because it advances visibly through sustained firepower. Soldiers witness anti-tank weapons failing to stop it. They observe defensive structures collapsing under direct assault. They hear the physical impact of claws against armor plating and bunker walls. This psychological pressure frequently destabilizes battlefield discipline. Guardsmen abandon firing positions prematurely. Civilian populations panic during evacuation attempts. Local command structures redirect disproportionate resources towards stopping individual Carnifex organisms, while the surrounding swarm exploits weakened sectors elsewhere. In this sense, the Carnifex functions not only as a destructive organism, but also as a battlefield distraction weapon designed to fracture organized resistance patterns. Despite its immense combat value, the Carnifex is not considered strategically irreplaceable by the Hive Mind. This is another important distinction between Tyranid warfare and Imperial doctrine. Human civilizations often invest enormous symbolic and logistical value into singular war machines, elite regiments, or irreplaceable relic vehicles. The Hive Mind values effectiveness above attachment. A Carnifex may be biologically expensive compared to lesser Tyranid organisms, but it remains expendable if its destruction creates greater opportunities for biomass acquisition elsewhere on the battlefield. This mindset influences deployment behavior. Carnifex organisms are frequently committed to frontal assaults, that would be considered unacceptable losses under most Imperial doctrines. The Hive Mind does not hesitate to sacrifice them if their advance weakens planetary defenses sufficiently for the swarm to achieve overall victory. As a result, defenders often encounter Carnifex charges executed with complete disregard for attritional damage. However, this expendability does not imply inefficiency. The Carnifex persists across countless hive fleets because the organism consistently justifies its biomass investment. It breaks fortified lines, it absorbs enemy firepower, it destroys armoured resistance, it destabilises morale, it opens pathways for swarm penetration. In strategic terms, the Carnifex remains one of the Tyranid invasion pattern's most reliable heavy assault assets. Its continued evolution also reflects the adaptive intelligence of the Hive Mind. Every major Tyranid war appears to produce new Carnifex mutations or refinements, responding to prior battlefield outcomes. Enhanced armor growths, modified weapon symbiotes, increased aggression profiles, and altered skeletal structures all suggest ongoing biological experimentation at a galactic scale. The Carnifex seen during one invasion may differ significantly from those encountered decades later, even while maintaining the same essential battlefield role. Within the wider Tyranid hierarchy, the Carnifex occupies an important symbolic position as well. Lesser organisms overwhelm through numbers, synapse creatures coordinate and direct. Specialized bioforms infiltrate, spread infection, or disrupt communications. The Carnifex represents visible domination through force. It embodies the stage of invasion, where the Hive Mind stops probing defenses and begins physically dismantling them. For many Imperial worlds, the first confirmed sighting of a Carnifex marks the moment when local commanders realize that conventional containment may no longer be possible. Earlier Tyranid contacts can sometimes be interpreted as raiding organisms, isolated infestations, or manageable swarm outbreaks. The appearance of Carnifex broods signals escalation into full-scale planetary consumption patterns. In conclusion, the Carnifex stands as one of the most effective examples of Tyranid biological warfare engineering. It possesses no pilot because it requires none. It needs no crew because its body itself fulfills every combat function simultaneously. Directed through synaptic command, adapted through genetic refinement, and deployed with ruthless strategic intent, the organism serves as a living assault engine capable of overcoming defenses that would halt lesser Tyranid forms. Its offensive capabilities allow it to tear apart infantry, vehicles, and fortifications through both ranged and close-range assault. Its defensive structure enables survival against weapon systems designed to destroy armored vehicles. Its battlefield use cases span urban siege warfare, anti-armor breakthrough operations, environmental assaults, and morale destabilization campaigns. Most importantly, its continued existence across countless Hive Fleet invasions demonstrates that the Hive Mind considers the Carnifex form highly successful. The Carnifex therefore cannot be understood merely as a monstrous alien creature. It is a biological solution to military resistance. It is a weapon platform evolved through endless war. It is the Tyranid answer to walls, tanks, strongholds, and defensive doctrine itself. Where lesser organisms flood the battlefield through numbers, the Carnifex advances to ensure that resistance physically collapses under the weight of the swarm. Administratum war archives concerning the Carnifex frequently begin with casualty revisions rather than initial contact reports. In many Tyranid invasions, the organism's presence altered battlefield outcomes so rapidly that early tactical assessments became inaccurate within hours. Defensive sectors initially categorized as stable often collapsed after Carnifex deployment breached armored lines or compromised fortified infrastructure. This recurring pattern caused several Segmentum command offices to reclassify Carnifex sightings as escalation indicators requiring immediate strategic re-evaluation rather than standard battlefield notation. Mechanicus battlefield observers reached similar conclusions from a different perspective. To the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Carnifex represented one of the clearest examples of Tyranid bioengineering superiority in the field of adaptive assault warfare. numerous Magos biologies attached to anti-Xenos campaigns recorded concern regarding the organism's efficiency-to-resource ratio. While Imperial heavy armor demanded refinery output, Forge World labor, replacement components, machine spirit maintenance, trained crews, fuel transport, and dedicated logistics chains, the Carnifex required only biomass and synaptic control infrastructure. This distinction produced serious strategic concerns among Imperial analysts. A destroyed Imperial tank company represented months or years of industrial investment, depending on supply conditions and Forge World proximity. A destroyed Carnifex, while dangerous and costly to eliminate, could theoretically be replaced by the Hive fleet through the consumption of conquered populations and ecosystems. In prolonged planetary wars, this asymmetry heavily favoured the Tyranid invasion pattern. Administratum observations consistently describe the Carnifex as a battlefield pressure organism rather than merely a heavy assault creature. Unlike some Tyranid bioforms that depend on ambush, infiltration, or specialised environmental conditions, the Carnifex performs most effectively when used openly and aggressively. Its deployment changes the behaviour of defenders immediately upon visual confirmation. Heavy weapons teams shift targeting priorities. Armoured reserves are redirected. Infantry firing patterns become less disciplined as soldiers focus disproportionately on the advancing organism. Strategic records from multiple tyrannic wars indicate that the Carnifex rarely operates as an isolated battlefield asset, unless remnants become separated during wider swarm fragmentation. Instead, the organism is commonly integrated into layered assault formations, where lesser Tyranids absorb defensive fire while Carnifex broods exploit weakened resistance points. Administratum tacticians compared this approach to ancient siege doctrines, where expendable infantry waves exhausted defenders before heavy breakthrough assets were committed against destabilized lines. The Adeptus Mechanicus noted additional complexities regarding the creature's operational efficiency. Unlike Imperial armoured vehicles, which often require terrain preparation, supply corridors, and repair access to maintain effectiveness, the Carnifex demonstrated unusually high environmental independence. Ash wastes, irradiated zones, chemically toxic industrial districts, frozen death worlds, and collapsed urban sectors all remained viable combat terrain for the organism. Some Magos observers concluded that the Tyranids intentionally favoured biological assault organisms precisely because living systems adapted more effectively to hostile planetary conditions than standardised mechanical infrastructure. Several Mechanicus reports focus specifically on the Carnifex locomotive structure. The creature's multi-layered musculature and distributed body mass allowed it to maintain mobility across terrain, where tracked vehicles frequently became immobilized. Rubble fields generated by orbital bombardment often created natural obstacles for Imperial armor, but these same environments sometimes enhanced Carnifex assault patterns by limiting defender maneuverability while allowing the organism to approach through debris-heavy cover zones. Administratum battlefield impressions repeatedly emphasize the psychological effects associated with Carnifex deployment. Imperial Guard regiments encountering the organism for the first time often overestimated its numerical presence due to the amount of battlefield disruption created by even a small brood. Vox transcripts recovered from failed defensive operations contain recurring descriptions of multiple heavy organisms, later determined through post-battle analysis to involve only one or two Carnifexes supported by dense, gaunt swarms. This distortion effect had practical consequences. Panic redeployments weakened neighbouring sectors. Reserve units arrived too late to reinforce primary defensive lines because commanders misjudged the scale of Tyranid heavy assault concentrations. In Hive City environments especially, the sound profile of the Carnifex contributed heavily to morale degradation. The combination of structural collapse, armoured impacts, biological screeching, and mass civilian panic created conditions where local command cohesion deteriorated rapidly even before direct physical contact occurred. Mechanicus observations also highlighted the efficiency of Carnifex bioweapon integration. Imperial armoured doctrines traditionally separate mobility, firepower, and durability across specialised vehicle classes. The Carnifex compresses all three into a single biological platform. A ranged support Carnifex may provide suppressive fire while simultaneously absorbing anti-armor retaliation and maintaining forward assault momentum. This reduced the Tyranid dependence on rigid battlefield formations and made predictive engagement modeling significantly more difficult for Imperial tacticians. The organism's adaptability received particular attention within Mechanicus xenobiological studies. Several Forge worlds involved in Tyranid counter-analysis concluded that Carnifex strains displayed battlefield evolution rates beyond conventional biological expectations. In campaigns involving prolonged resistance, later Carnifex broods occasionally exhibited armor growths, altered biomorph arrangements, or environmental tolerances not present during earlier engagements. While the exact mechanisms remain imperfectly understood, the Hive Mind's ability to modify heavy assault organisms during ongoing campaigns was considered strategically alarming. Administratum analysts assigned special importance to the Carnifex role in siege escalation. Tyranid invasions typically progress through recognizable operational phases. Initial infiltration organisms destabilize local populations. Vanguard swarms disrupt outer defenses. Synapse coordination increases as invasion density expands. Carnifex deployment often marks the transition from pressure warfare into deliberate structural annihilation. This pattern became especially evident during assaults against fortress worlds and hive cities. Defensive lines capable of resisting gaunt saturation for extended periods frequently collapsed within hours once Carnifex organisms entered breach zones. Administratum observers noted that the creature's value extended beyond direct casualty generation. Its primary battlefield contribution was often the destruction of defensive geometry itself. Walls, choke points, barricades, firing nests, trench systems, and armoured corridors lost strategic value once a Carnifex physically penetrated them. One recurring observation involved the organism's resistance to suppressive bombardment. Standard anti-infantry artillery proved largely ineffective against mature Carnifex strains unless saturation density reached extreme levels. Even direct heavy artillery impacts occasionally failed to neutralize specimens immediately. This forced Imperial commanders into difficult ammunition allocation decisions during prolonged engagements. Resources normally reserved for enemy armor or fortified emplacements often had to be redirected toward biological targets instead. Mechanicus strategists also expressed concern regarding the Carnifex's repair and sustainability profile. Imperial armor damage during combat frequently requires retrieval, field repair crews, spare parts, machine sanctification rights, and secured maintenance facilities. Tyranid bioforms bypass many of these logistical constraints through biological regeneration and biomass reclamation. Wounded Carnifex organisms capable of withdrawal may later reappear after partial regeneration or complete reabsorption into reclamation pools. This regenerative flexibility complicated long-term attrition planning. A damaged Imperial armoured battalion usually represented permanently reduced combat capability unless reinforcement supply chains remained intact. A damaged Carnifex brood represented temporary battlefield degradation at worst, provided the Hive fleet retained access to sufficient biomass reserves. Administratum records from worlds ultimately lost to Tyranid invasion frequently describe the Carnifex as the organism that ended realistic hopes of conventional defense. Lesser Tyranids could sometimes be delayed through layered artillery zones, defensive minefields, and mass infantry formations. Carnifex broods undermined these strategies by physically breaking fortified resistance faster than defenders could restore cohesion. Particular attention was given to the organism's use in coordinated swarm timing. Carnifexes were rarely committed at random intervals. Instead, they often appeared immediately after defenders exhausted critical ammunition reserves or suffered communication breakdowns caused by prior Tyranid pressure. This suggested that the Hive Mind understood not only battlefield geography, but also human fatigue cycles and defensive resource depletion patterns. Mechanicus theorists debated whether the Carnifex's design reflected direct evolutionary refinement or deliberate genetic engineering by higher Tyranid intelligence structures. Some Magos biology argue that the organism displayed too much tactical optimization to result purely from natural adaptive pressure. Others believed the distinction was irrelevant because Tyranid biology itself functioned as a form of directed engineering under Hive Mind control. Certain Forge World archives also contain speculation regarding the Carnifex's symbolic battlefield role within Tyranid warfare doctrine. It is believed by some xenobiological scholars that the organism serves not only as a practical siege beast, but also as a visible expression of overwhelming force intended to accelerate prey species demoralization. This theory remains unconfirmed, though battlefield evidence strongly supports the idea that Carnifex deployment consistently amplifies panic responses among defending populations. Administratum strategic findings eventually concluded that conventional Imperial doctrine frequently underestimated the Carnifex by interpreting it solely as a monstrous infantry organism rather than as a mobile siege platform. Campaigns where commanders treated Carnifex broods with the same priority level as enemy armoured spearheads generally achieved higher defensive survival rates than campaigns where the organisms were classified as oversized assault infantry. This re-evaluation altered several anti-Tyranid tactical doctrines across affected sectors. Dedicated anti-monstrosity kill teams, concentrated melter reserves, reinforced firing corridors, and overlapping heavy weapon zones became more common in worlds considered vulnerable to Tyranid invasion. However, even these adaptations produced inconsistent success due to the Hive Mind's continuing evolutionary flexibility. Ultimately, both the Adeptus Administratum and Adeptus Mechanicus reached similar operational conclusions despite approaching the organism from different perspectives. To the Administratum, the Carnifex represented a strategic destabilization asset, capable of collapsing defensive structure integrity and command cohesion. To the Mechanicus, it represented an extremely efficient example of living warfare engineering optimized for adaptability, resilience, and siege penetration. In either interpretation, the outcome remained the same. Wherever Carnifex broods appeared in significant numbers, static defense strategies rapidly approached failure conditions. The organism did not merely assist the Tyranid swarm, it transformed the battlefield itself into an environment where conventional resistance became increasingly unsustainable. Among the more difficult subjects examined by the Adeptus Mechanicus during Tyranid conflicts was the question of comparative production efficiency. Imperial war doctrine traditionally measures battlefield assets through industrial cost, forge output capacity, transport requirements, maintenance burden, and crew survivability. The Carnifex complicated these calculations because it did not conform to any recognizable manufacturing model. It possessed no assembly line origin, no machine fabrication sequence, and no standardized replacement process comparable to Imperial armored production. Administratum logisticians attempting to quantify the effective construction cost of a Carnifex encountered immediate conceptual problems. The organism was not purchased, manufactured, or commissioned in the human sense. It was grown from reclaimed biomass gathered through planetary consumption. Every civilian population, ecosystem, corpse, oceanic organism, agricultural zone, and industrial protein reserve absorbed by the Tyranid swarm potentially contributed material toward the creation of future bioforms. This meant that the effective cost of a Carnifex could not be isolated cleanly from the wider Tyranid invasion cycle. A Forge world constructing a Baneblade super heavy tank required refined metals, plasma reactor components, sacred template adherence, labor forces, machine rights, ammunition infrastructure, fuel reserves, and trained crews. A Hive fleet required only biomass conversion and gestation capacity. In strategic terms, the Carnifex represented a terrifying inversion of Imperial logistics doctrine. The prey population itself became the raw material for future enemy reinforcements. Mechanicus biologists attached to anti-Tyranid operations noted that the Carnifex appeared particularly efficient within this system. The organism's structure balanced mass, durability, and offensive capability without reaching the extreme biomass investment levels associated with larger Tyranid bioforms such as hierodules or biotitans. Some magos theorize that the Carnifex existed within an optimal biological threshold, where battlefield value remained extremely high, while reproductive costs stayed sustainable for rapid deployment. This efficiency may explain why Carnifex strains appear across so many different hive fleets, despite significant variation in genetic adaptation patterns. The organism fulfills too many battlefield roles too effectively for the Hive Mind to abandon the template. Siege assault, anti-armor engagement, morale destabilization, breach penetration, urban warfare, and defensive collapse operations can all be executed by modified Carnifex strains without requiring entirely new biological categories. Administratum supply analysts observed another important distinction between Imperial and Tyranid warfare systems. Human military logistics depend heavily on pre-battle preparation. Ammunition stockpiles must be transported, fuel lines must remain protected, spare parts must arrive on schedule, crew rotations must be maintained. Every armoured company deployed into combat carries with it an enormous invisible burden of logistical support. The Carnifex reduces many of these dependencies through biological integration. Its weapon systems are part of its body. Ammunition is generated organically. Locomotion depends on muscle, rather than fuel combustion or reactor systems. Damage recovery occurs biologically rather than mechanically. The organism therefore requires remarkably little battlefield support once deployed, provided the surrounding swarm ecosystem remains operational. This does not mean the Carnifex is maintenance-free. Adeptus Mechanicus studies repeatedly emphasize that Tyranid bioforms rely on constant biomass intake at the species level. A hive fleet unable to consume sufficient organic matter eventually loses the ability to sustain large-scale deployments. Carnifex organisms are metabolically expensive due to their immense musculature, armor density, and weapon symbiotes. Prolonged campaigns without biomass replenishment likely strain hive fleet sustainability significantly. However, Tyranid invasions are specifically designed to avoid such conditions. Consumption follows conquest continuously. Fallen defenders, destroyed ecosystems, livestock populations, agricultural reserves, and even atmospheric organic compounds may eventually be harvested into digestion pools. Administratum observers concluded with increasing alarm that every failed defensive operation effectively strengthened future Tyranid deployments. Maintenance observations recorded by the Mechanicus revealed additional unsettling details regarding Carnifex survivability. Damaged Imperial armor often becomes less effective gradually as systems degrade. Engines fail, weapons jam, suspension systems weaken, crew fatigue accumulates. The Carnifex instead demonstrated a tendency toward catastrophic persistence. Even heavily wounded specimens frequently retained partial combat functionality until total structural collapse occurred. This resilience stemmed partly from biological redundancy. Multiple secondary organs reduced vulnerability to single-point failures. Thick chitin plating protected vital systems beneath layered tissue structures. Neural pathways appeared distributed rather than centralized, in the same manner as human anatomy. As a result, injuries that should logically incapacitate the organism often failed to immediately halt offensive momentum. Some Mechanicus reports described Carnifex's continuing assault operations despite the destruction of major limb sections, severe cranial trauma, or extensive burns from plasma and melter weaponry. This generated serious concern regarding battlefield kill confirmation procedures. Imperial troops accustomed to disabling enemy vehicles through mobility kills or crew elimination often discovered that equivalent damage thresholds proved insufficient against Tyranid heavy organisms. The supply implications of Carnifex deployment also differed sharply from Imperial expectations. A Baneblade or Lehman Russ requires protected transport corridors, secure repair depots, fuel carriers, and ammunition convoys. The Carnifex moves with the swarm itself. Supply lines are effectively replaced by consumption territory. As long as the hive fleet continues feeding, battlefield sustainment remains viable. This created severe strategic pressure on defending worlds. Scorched earth denial operations became increasingly common during Tyranid invasions because commanders recognized that abandoned population centers, agricultural zones, and corpse fields represented future Tyranid reinforcement stockpiles. In some campaigns, Imperial forces deliberately destroyed their own food reserves, industrial livestock, and hab block populations rather than allow those resources to be reclaimed by the swarm. Mechanicus strength analyses consistently identified the Carnifex's greatest advantage as operational versatility. Most Imperial armoured systems specialise heavily. Artillery vehicles perform bombardment roles. Main battle tanks focus on direct engagement. Siege vehicles breach fortifications. Anti-air platforms target aerial threats. The Carnifex condenses several battlefield functions into a single adaptive organism. A close assault Carnifex can break infantry lines, engage armoured vehicles, survive heavy return fire, and breach structural defences simultaneously. Gunbeast variants provide suppressive fire while maintaining forward pressure. Stonecrusher strains excel in siege environments. Thornback strains enhance swarm penetration capability. This adaptability reduces the Tyranid need for rigid force composition structures common within Imperial military doctrine. Another major strength involved morale degradation. Administratum battlefield reports repeatedly emphasized that Carnifex sightings caused disproportionate psychological damage relative to actual deployment numbers. Soldiers witnessing massive biological organisms survive concentrated anti-armor fire frequently experienced discipline collapse even before direct engagement occurred. The organism's physicality contributed heavily to this effect. Imperial troops were accustomed to fighting machines or humanoid enemies. The Carnifex blurred distinctions between creature and war engine in ways many defenders found deeply unsettling. It bled, roared, and moved like a living predator while simultaneously demonstrating battlefield durability associated with armoured vehicles. This combination amplified fear responses among inexperienced personnel. Mechanicus tacticians also praised the Carnifex environmental adaptability. The organism functioned effectively across ash wastes, hive cities, toxic industrial sectors, jungle death worlds, frozen tundra environments, and subterranean conflict zones. Unlike many Imperial vehicles, it did not require extensive terrain accommodation or specialized support infrastructure before deployment. Despite these strengths, the Carnifex possessed identifiable weaknesses. Administratum analyses stressed repeatedly that isolated Carnifex organisms remained vulnerable to concentrated heavy firepower when denied swarm support. Lascannons, melter weapons, plasma batteries, artillery saturation, and coordinated anti-armor tactics could destroy even heavily armored strains if sufficient firing discipline was maintained. Mobility also represented a situational weakness under certain battlefield conditions. Though more terrain flexible than most armored vehicles, the Carnifex still depended heavily on forward momentum. Kill zones designed to funnel movement through overlapping heavy weapon corridors occasionally proved effective, particularly when supported by elevated firing positions and minefield layering. Mechanicus observers further noted that the Carnifex lacked the extreme ranged engagement capacity of some Imperial heavy armor platforms. Baneblades, basilisks, shadow swords, and other long-range systems could theoretically engage Tyranid heavy organisms before close assault distance was achieved. However, this advantage depended entirely on maintaining battlefield spacing and uninterrupted firing solutions, conditions Tyranid swarm tactics consistently attempted to disrupt. Synaptic dependence represented another partial vulnerability. While the Carnifex retained instinctive aggression independently, coordinated swarm efficiency declined noticeably when nearby synapse organisms were eliminated. Imperial anti-Tyranid doctrine therefore increasingly emphasized simultaneous targeting of both heavy assault organisms and synaptic command nodes to fracture battlefield cohesion. Some Mechanicus studies also suggested that the Carnifex's immense biological aggression occasionally reduced tactical flexibility. Unlike highly intelligent synapse creatures capable of complex adaptation during combat, the Carnifex often prioritized direct assault momentum above positional caution. Skilled commanders occasionally exploited this through sacrificial bait positions, controlled retreats, or engineered terrain collapses designed to channel the organism into pre-prepared kill zones. Nevertheless, such victories were rarely cost-efficient. Administratum casualty assessments consistently concluded that destroying Carnifex broods required disproportionate expenditure of heavy weaponry, manpower, and defensive infrastructure. Even successful defenses often emerged strategically weakened afterward due to ammunition depletion and structural devastation. One particularly concerning Mechanicus conclusion involved long-term Tyranid adaptation trends. Several Magos biologists theorized that the Carnifex was not a final evolutionary form, but rather an ongoing template undergoing continuous refinement through battlefield feedback. Every failed Imperial strategy potentially contributed data toward future Tyranid improvements. This possibility carried grim implications for prolonged galactic conflict. By late-stage Tyrannic war analyses, Administratum strategic projections increasingly categorized the Carnifex not simply as a dangerous organism, but as a logistical weapon. Its existence forced defenders into economically unsustainable battlefield responses. Ammunition expenditure increased dramatically, heavy armor attrition accelerated, infrastructure repair burdens multiplied, morale recovery demands expanded. Even worlds that survived Tyranid invasions often suffered severe long-term industrial collapse afterward. In practical terms, the Carnifex achieved exactly what the Hive Mind required. It transformed static defense into resource exhaustion. It converted fortification advantage into liability. It forced prey civilizations to spend irreplaceable industrial capacity, merely delaying inevitable swarm pressure. The Adeptus Mechanicus ultimately regarded the Carnifex with particular unease, because it demonstrated a horrifying principle. Biological warfare had reached a level where living organisms could rival or surpass dedicated war machines without relying on mechanical industry at all. The Carnifex was not merely competing against Imperial armored doctrine. In many operational categories, it was outperforming it through evolution alone. Administratum battle archives concerning the Carnifex span multiple segmentums and several major Tyrannic conflicts, though many records remain incomplete due to the destruction of entire planetary defense networks during invasion events. Despite fragmented documentation, a consistent operational pattern emerges across nearly every confirmed engagement involving substantial Carnifex deployment. Wherever the organism appeared in concentrated numbers, defensive attrition accelerated sharply and armoured resistance suffered disproportionately high structural losses. One of the earliest major Imperial encounters with large-scale Carnifex deployment occurred during the conflicts associated with Hive Fleet Behemoth in the closing years of Millennia 41, year 745. Prior Tyranid encounters had already demonstrated the swarm's capacity for overwhelming infantry assaults, but the appearance of massive siege organisms within Behemoth's advance altered Imperial tactical assumptions significantly. Battle reports from frontier worlds consumed during the opening stages of the Behemoth invasion frequently described defensive lines collapsing after living battering organisms breached fortress walls previously considered resistant to conventional assault. Many commanders initially interpreted the creatures as isolated monstrosities rather than standardized Tyranid heavy assault forms. This misunderstanding delayed effective countermeasures during several early engagements. During the defense operations surrounding Macragge, Ultramarine and Imperial Guard forces encountered multiple Carnifex broods integrated directly into Tyranid assault waves. Administratum analyses of surviving battle recordings noted that the organisms were consistently deployed against structurally important targets, including gate fortifications, armoured reserve positions, ammunition depots, and defensive artillery sectors. Mechanicus observers studying the Macragge campaign reached several important conclusions regarding Carnifex effectiveness. The organism demonstrated exceptional synergy with Gaunt saturation tactics. Lesser Tyranids forced defenders into continuous suppressive fire, while Carnifexes advanced through the resulting confusion toward priority targets. This layered assault pattern repeatedly degraded firing discipline across otherwise highly organised Imperial defensive sectors. Particularly concerning were reports involving Carnifex survivability under concentrated fire. Several Ultramarines' tactical accounts describe specimens continuing to advance after sustaining impacts from plasma weaponry, missile strikes, and Lascanon fire. Though ultimately destroyable, the amount of force required to halt even a single mature Carnifex frequently exceeded projected ammunition expenditure models. Administratum analysts reviewing casualty records after the behemoth conflicts concluded that the Carnifex performed best when used not as an isolated killing organism, but as a pressure multiplier. Its battlefield value extended beyond direct lethality into disruption efficiency. Defenders distracted by advancing Carnifexes often failed to respond effectively to surrounding swarm infiltration. The later invasions associated with Hive Fleet Kraken further expanded Imperial understanding of Carnifex operational flexibility. Unlike Behemoth's direct assault emphasis, Kraken utilized fragmentation tactics and distributed swarm penetration. Carnifex strains deployed within Kraken formations frequently appeared in rapid assault roles, targeting communication hubs, isolated armoured groups, and evacuation corridors rather than static fortress assaults alone. Mechanicus battle studies from Kraken-related conflicts highlighted the organism's environmental adaptability. Jungle warfare campaigns proved especially revealing. Imperial armoured columns attempting pursuit operations through dense terrain repeatedly suffered ambush-style assaults from concealed Carnifex organisms, supported by surrounding bioforms. The creature's ability to navigate hostile terrain without dependence on prepared infrastructure allowed it to operate effectively where many Imperial vehicles struggled. Administratum tactical reviews also noted increasing biomorph diversity during the Kraken invasions. Earlier Imperial assumptions that Carnifexes followed relatively fixed anatomical configurations became increasingly unreliable. Some strains displayed enhanced speed profiles, others incorporated heavier ranged bioweapons. Certain siege-adapted variants exhibited reinforced exoskeletal growths capable of resisting weapon types previously considered effective. The Tyrannic wars associated with Hive Fleet Leviathan produced some of the most detailed Mechanicus records concerning Carnifex battlefield performance. By this stage, Imperial anti-Tyranid doctrine had evolved considerably. Dedicated anti-monstrosity kill teams, melter saturation units, overlapping heavy weapon fields, and aerial bombardment protocols had become more common. Despite these adaptations, Carnifex effectiveness remained alarmingly high in prolonged engagements. Several Mechanicus tactical studies examined urban warfare operations during Leviathan invasions. Hive cities represented some of the most structurally defended environments available to the Imperium, combining layered fortifications, elevated firing zones, armoured patrol corridors, and concentrated defensive infrastructure. Carnifex broods repeatedly proved capable of destabilizing these systems through direct structural assault. One notable recurring observation involved the creature's use against transportation choke points. Administratum reports from multiple Hive World campaigns documented Carnifex organisms targeting bridge systems, transit tunnels, elevator shafts, and hab block junctions. Rather than merely killing defenders, the organisms systematically disrupted evacuation routes and reinforcement mobility. This amplified civilian panic while isolating defensive sectors from one another. Mechanicus analysts studying these engagements concluded that the Carnifex displayed battlefield behavior patterns indicating more than instinctive aggression alone. The organism consistently attacked infrastructure with strategic value, disproportionate to simple prey density. Whether this reflected direct synaptic targeting or broader Hive Mind tactical awareness remained uncertain, but the operational outcome remained highly effective. Carnifex strains also demonstrated notable effectiveness against armoured spearhead doctrine. Imperial armoured warfare traditionally depends on maintaining range superiority, firing coordination, and formation cohesion. Tyranid swarm pressure undermined these conditions continuously. Once Carnifex organisms entered engagement range, armoured formations frequently lost manoeuvre flexibility due to terrain congestion, swarm interference, and visibility disruption. Several Astra Militarum armoured regiments recorded situations where Carnifexes physically overturned lighter vehicles or immobilised heavier armour through repeated assault impacts. Crushing Claw variants proved particularly dangerous during close-range engagements involving confined urban sectors or damaged terrain where tanks could not reposition effectively. Administratum battlefield reviews consistently emphasise the economic asymmetry of these encounters. Destroying a Carnifex often required concentrated use of anti-armour weaponry, artillery assets, or elite infantry formations, yet the Tyranid swarm could potentially reclaim enough biomass from the battlefield afterward to produce replacement organisms in future invasions. This imbalance created serious long-term strategic concerns regarding sustainable attrition warfare against Tyranid fleets. The Adeptus Mechanicus also devoted significant study toward the Screamer Killer strain due to its extreme assault specialization. During several major tyrannic engagements, Screamer Killers spearheaded breakthrough assaults against heavily fortified defensive lines. Their combination of bioplasma projection, reinforced musculature, and aggressive close combat behavior allowed them to function almost as biological shock weapons. Reports from defenders frequently described Screamer Killers continuing forward movement even while engulfed in fire or sustaining catastrophic visible injuries. Some Mechanicus xenobiologists theorized that the strain's neural aggression profile intentionally suppressed all self-preservation instincts in favor of maximum offensive momentum. Stonecrusher variants received similar attention during fortress sieges and subterranean conflicts. Administratum siege records from several Hive-world defences documented these organisms dismantling ferrocrete barriers, collapsing bunker entrances, and breaching underground tunnel systems previously considered resistant to biological assault. The combination of reinforced skeletal density and specialised crushing appendages made Stonecrushers exceptionally effective in confined siege environments. Vehicle effectiveness studies performed by the Mechanicus eventually categorized the Carnifex as one of the Tyranid swarm's most reliable multi-role assault organisms. Unlike specialized bioforms limited to narrow operational conditions, the Carnifex maintained combat value across nearly every battlefield environment encountered by Imperial forces. Its effectiveness derived from several overlapping advantages. Durability allowed survival under concentrated fire long enough to close engagement distance. Adaptability enabled Hive fleets to modify deployment configurations according to resistance patterns. Environmental independence reduced logistical vulnerability. Psychological impact destabilized defensive discipline. Most importantly, integration within wider swarm tactics prevented defenders from isolating the organism cleanly during battle. Mechanicus tacticians repeatedly stressed that the Carnifex should never be evaluated independently from surrounding Tyranid ecosystem pressure. A lone Carnifex remained dangerous. A Carnifex advancing inside a synchronized swarm became exponentially more effective because defenders lost the ability to dedicate uninterrupted firepower toward a single target. Despite these strengths, Administratum records did identify conditions under which Carnifex effectiveness declined. Open terrain engagement zones with long-range artillery support favoured Imperial defensive doctrine if swarm screening organisms could be neutralised early. Orbital superiority also significantly reduced Carnifex operational survivability, particularly when sustained bombardment prevented swarm concentration. Elite Space Marine formations equipped with coordinated anti-armor weaponry demonstrated higher than average Carnifex kill rates compared to standard Guard regiments. However, even successful Astartes engagements frequently involved substantial casualties and ammunition expenditure disproportionate to single organism elimination. One particularly grim Administratum conclusion emerged from post-war analyses involving worlds that survived Tyranid invasion attempts. Even in defensive victories, Carnifex deployment often inflicted severe long-term infrastructure damage. Hive districts collapsed beyond repair, industrial sectors became unusable, transportation systems required decades of reconstruction. The organism therefore achieved strategic disruption value, even when individual broods were eventually destroyed. Certain suppressed Mechanicus reports contain speculative theories suggesting that the Carnifex may represent only an intermediate stage within broader Tyranid siege evolution. Some Magos biologists observe that newer Hive fleet strains appeared increasingly optimized for anti-armor warfare compared to earlier Tyrannic encounters. This remains unconfirmed, though continued biomorph diversification supports concerns regarding ongoing Tyranid adaptive refinement. Administratum officials ultimately classified the Carnifex as one of the primary escalation indicators during active Tyranid invasions. Its presence signified that the Hive Mind had committed heavy biological assets toward direct defensive collapse operations. Worlds reporting sustained Carnifex activity frequently experienced rapid deterioration of static defense viability afterward. From the perspective of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Carnifex represented a deeply unsettling realization regarding Tyranid warfare doctrine. Human civilization spent millennia refining armored warfare through metallurgy, combustion systems, reactor technologies, sacred machine rights, and industrial engineering. The Tyranids achieved comparable battlefield functions entirely through biological adaptation. The Carnifex did not require factories, machine spirits, or forge worlds. It required only biomass, genetic memory, and war. In conclusion, Administratum and Mechanicus records consistently portray the Carnifex as one of the Tyranid swarm's most operationally effective heavy assault organisms. Across multiple Tyrannic wars and countless planetary invasions, the creature demonstrated exceptional performance in siege warfare, armored disruption, infrastructure destruction, and morale collapse operations. Its battlefield role remained brutally efficient and strategically simple. Find resistance, absorb retaliation, break the line, allow the swarm through. Where the Carnifex appeared in force, the survival expectancy of static defense doctrine declined rapidly. The organism was not merely a monster within the Tyranid arsenal, it was one of the Hive Mind's most successful answers to civilization itself. Inquisitorial archives concerning the Carnifex differ substantially from standard Administratum battlefield records and Adeptus Mechanicus biological assessments. While Imperial military departments focused primarily on operational threat analysis and tactical countermeasures, the Inquisition approached the organism from a broader perspective involving behavioral irregularities, unexplained adaptation patterns, psychological effects, and possible indications of higher Tyranid strategic intent. Many of these records remain heavily restricted. Several Ordo Xenos investigations opened after the Tyrannic Wars concluded that the Carnifex displayed behavioral consistency too precise to be explained solely through instinctive swarm aggression. Early Imperial doctrine categorized the organism as a living siege engine directed by synaptic command structures. However, certain inquisitorial observers began questioning whether some Carnifex strains demonstrated battlefield judgment exceeding expected biological conditioning. One recurring concern involved target prioritization. During multiple recorded invasions, Carnifex organisms consistently ignored exposed civilian concentrations in favor of infrastructure sectors holding long-term strategic value. Defensive reactors, void shield generators, communication spires, ammunition depots, subterranean transit arteries, and orbital relay stations received repeated concentrated assaults, even when easier biomass targets remained available elsewhere. Mechanicus analysts attributed this to Hive Mind tactical coordination. Some inquisitorial investigators disagreed. Several Ordo Xenos reports proposed that the Carnifex may possess more independent battlefield processing capability than officially acknowledged. This theory remains controversial and unsupported by definitive proof, but numerous battlefield recordings contributed to ongoing suspicion. In particular, isolated Carnifex organisms cut off from nearby synapse creatures occasionally continued executing highly effective assault behavior despite expected degradation patterns. One restricted report from an unnamed hive world described a wounded Carnifex trapped beneath collapsed ferrocrete after sustained orbital bombardment. According to surviving witnesses, the organism remained immobile for nearly 13 standard hours while Imperial engineers established temporary heavy weapon nests nearby. The creature then emerged only after defensive personnel concentration reached maximum density within the sector. The resulting assault killed over 200 defenders before armoured response units neutralised the organism. Official Mechanicus review concluded that the Carnifex likely remained dormant due to injury recovery. The Inquisition classified the incident differently. Another series of observations involved unusual Carnifex interactions with Genestealer cult infestations. During several planetary purges, inquisitorial agents noted that cult populations often displayed extreme ritual fixation on large Tyranid bioforms, particularly Carnifex strains associated with invasion spearheads. While Genestealer worship patterns toward Tyranid organisms are well documented, some cult records described Carnifexes using language normally reserved for divine executioners or sacred punishments rather than simple war beasts. Recovered cult text from one suppressed investigation referred to certain Carnifex organisms as the Breakers of False Permanence and the Living Collapse. Most of these writings were destroyed under contamination protocols, though fragments survived within Ordo Xenos archival storage. Some inquisitors interpreted these references merely as religious hysteria generated by Tyranid invasion trauma. Others considered the symbolism potentially significant. One controversial theory proposed that the Carnifex occupies a deliberate psychological role within the Hive Mind beyond practical battlefield utility. According to this hypothesis, the organism's exaggerated physical brutality serves not only military objectives, but also accelerated prey demoralization through visual inevitability. Put simply, the Carnifex may exist partly because intelligent prey species lose hope faster when confronted by overwhelming biological force at close range. This theory remains unconfirmed. Nevertheless, inquisitorial records repeatedly document severe morale collapse associated specifically with Carnifex encounters. Infantry survivors exposed to prolonged close-range engagements frequently exhibited recurring psychological symptoms afterward, including structural phobia, claustrophobic stress responses, combat paralysis during heavy impact sounds, and obsessive fixation on crushing injuries. Several commissariat reports noted unusual increases in summary executions following Tyranid campaigns involving extensive Carnifex deployment. Guardsmen accused of cowardice often displayed symptoms more consistent with extreme trauma exposure than simple battlefield panic. Certain Ordo Xenos investigators quietly questioned whether Imperial authorities systematically underestimated the psychological effects generated by large Tyranid assault organisms. One especially disturbing inquisitorial observation involved post-battle corpse patterns. After several Carnifex-led breaches, recovery teams discovered large clusters of dead defenders who showed no direct signs of physical assault despite collapsing near intact defensive positions. Medical examinations identified stress-induced cardiac failure, neurological shock, or self-inflicted injuries during attempted retreats. In one instance, a fortified bunker was found fully operational internally despite all personnel inside having died from catastrophic panic reactions before the Carnifex physically reached the structure. This incident was sealed under restricted classification. Certain inquisitors also expressed concern regarding the Hive Mind's apparent understanding of Imperial architecture and defensive behavior. Carnifex assaults frequently targeted load-bearing structures, evacuation bottlenecks, or reactor stabilization sectors with remarkable efficiency. Some investigators argued that these attack patterns suggested more than instinctive aggression. It is believed by some within the Ordo Xenos that Tyranid organisms may absorb fragments of strategic memory through biomass consumption. Under this theory, every consumed world potentially improves future Tyranid understanding of prey infrastructure and military doctrine. If accurate, the Carnifex may not merely be evolving physically between invasions. It may also be inheriting accumulated siege knowledge from countless prior civilizations. The theory remains speculative. No verified evidence confirms direct strategic memory transfer within Carnifex strains specifically. Even so, inquisitorial concern intensified after repeated invasions demonstrated increasingly effective anti-fortification behavior across widely separated Hive fleets. One classified investigation examined reports involving a Carnifex specimen surviving far longer than expected after synaptic disruption. Standard Tyranid doctrine predicts behavioral degradation when bioforms lose connection to the hive mind. Lesser organisms often become feral or directionless under such conditions. Yet during a failed containment operation near the eastern fringe, a heavily damaged Carnifex reportedly continued coordinated assaults against Imperial positions for nearly 2 standard days after confirmed elimination of all nearby synapse organisms. Witness accounts remain inconsistent. Some claim the organism entered periods of apparent stillness before resuming movement only when defenders attempted relocation operations. Others insisted the Carnifex actively tracked heavy weapon emplacements while ignoring exposed infantry. Official records ultimately categorized the event as unreliable battlefield confusion caused by prolonged combat stress. The Inquisition did not fully close the case. Another recurring conspiracy finding involved the timing of Carnifex deployments during planetary invasions. Several Ordo-Xenos analysts concluded that the hive mind frequently delayed heavy assault organism commitment until defenders reached maximum psychological exhaustion. Initial swarm waves consumed ammunition reserves and disrupted communications. Carnifex broods then appeared only after defenders began believing their lines might stabilize. According to one inquisitorial strategist, this pattern resembled calculated emotional manipulation rather than simple tactical sequencing. Whether the hive mind consciously understands fear in the human sense remains unknown. However, it clearly understands collapse. Some inquisitors also investigated reports of battlefield hesitation among veteran defenders who had previously survived Carnifex engagements. Unlike ordinary combat fatigue, these cases involved experienced personnel refusing fortified assignments specifically associated with structural breach zones. One Cadian officer reportedly requested immediate penal reassignment rather than return to anti-Tyranid siege duty after witnessing Carnifex assaults during a prior campaign. His written statement described the creatures as the moment a fortress realizes it can die. The document was later archived under psychological contamination review. Observations involving Space Marine chapters proved equally unsettling. Astartes forces generally displayed far greater resistance to morale degradation than ordinary human troops. Nevertheless, several Ordo-Xenos records noted unusual levels of tactical caution during campaigns involving mature Carnifex broods. Veteran Space Marine commanders increasingly prioritized immediate elimination of heavy Tyranid organisms, even when broader strategic threats remained active elsewhere. This suggested not fear in the conventional sense, but professional recognition of extreme battlefield destabilization potential. Some conspiracy findings extended even further. A minority within the Ordo-Xenos proposed that the Carnifex may intentionally resemble ancient primal predator archetypes, common across intelligent species. Heavy frontal anatomy, crushing jaws, oversized predatory limbs, charging behavior, and overwhelming mass all trigger instinctive threat recognition patterns within the human nervous system. Under this theory, the hive mind may deliberately engineer bioforms exploiting universal prey psychology. There is no definitive evidence supporting this hypothesis. Still, inquisitorial xenopsychologists considered the possibility difficult to dismiss entirely, given Tyranid adaptive sophistication elsewhere. Ultimately, Inquisition impressions of the Carnifex differed from those of other Imperial institutions, because the Ordo-Xenos viewed the organism not merely as a battlefield asset, but as a symptom of something larger. The Administratum saw siege capability, the Mechanicus saw biological engineering, the Inquisition saw intention. Not necessarily individual intelligence within the Carnifex itself, but evidence that the hive mind's understanding of warfare may extend beyond physical destruction into psychological collapse, infrastructure targeting, morale erosion, and adaptive strategic terror. This realization disturbed many within the Inquisition more than the organism's physical power ever did. A beast can be killed, a weapon can be countered, but an enemy capable of learning exactly how civilizations psychologically break under pressure represents a far greater threat. The Carnifex may simply be the most visible expression of that process. Ordo Xenos interrogative records involving the Carnifex rarely focus on the organism directly. Few human witnesses survive close encounters in conditions suitable for coherent debriefing, and even fewer possess the technical knowledge required to provide useful biological analysis afterward. Instead, inquisitorial investigations often concentrated on secondary effects surrounding Carnifex deployment patterns, survivor psychological instability, battlefield anomalies, and unexplained Tyranid behavioral irregularities. Many of these findings remain disputed within the Inquisition itself. One recurring category of interrogative evidence came from survivors recovered after planetary breach events where Carnifex organisms penetrated defensive sectors previously classified as secure. Across dozens of unrelated worlds, witnesses described remarkably similar sensory impressions despite vast cultural and environmental differences. Survivors repeatedly reported perceiving the approach of Carnifex broods before visual confirmation occurred. The descriptions varied. Some identified deep structural vibrations traveling through walls and flooring long before contact. Others described low-frequency sound pressure causing nausea, chest pain, or disorientation. Several reported a growing sensation of compression or weight inside enclosed structures moments before breaches occurred. Mechanicus analysts initially dismissed these accounts as predictable responses to siege trauma. The Inquisition continued collecting them. One Ordo Xenos investigation involving surviving manufacturing workers revealed especially unusual testimony. Multiple civilians independently claimed that automated labor systems began malfunctioning shortly before Carnifex assaults reached their district. Conveyor systems froze, internal pressure alarms activated without visible damage, servo skulls lost directional stability. In some cases, machine spirits reportedly entered emergency shutdown states despite the absence of direct electromagnetic interference. No definitive explanation was ever established. Some Mechanicus representatives argued that local infrastructure damage caused cascading system instability. Others privately suggested that Tyranid bioelectric or vibrational emissions may affect sensitive machine systems under specific conditions. This theory remains unverified. Another anomaly category involved battlefield fauna responses. On several death worlds and frontier colonies, native predator species reportedly fled large geographic regions, hours before Carnifex deployment zones became active. Arbeit's reports from one mining settlement documented mass avian migration and subterranean fauna emergence, preceding a Tyranid assault by nearly a full standard day. Ordo Xenos, xenobiologists noted that native ecosystems often reacted to approaching Carnifex organisms, with behavior normally associated with major seismic events or apex predator displacement. Some investigators speculated that the Carnifex emits low-frequency biological signals, perceptible to animal nervous systems before human detection becomes possible. Others considered the phenomenon merely incidental to wider Tyranid swarm movement. Interrogations involving captured Genestealer cult members produced even more disturbing material. Under chemical extraction and psychic examination, several cultists described recurring dreams involving enormous Tyranid organisms moving through collapsing cities long before actual invasion events began. Carnifex forms appeared repeatedly within these accounts, despite many cult members lacking formal Tyranid battlefield exposure. One cult leader described the Carnifex as the shape the mind sees when resistance ends. Another referred to them as the punishment for permanence. Such statements were officially categorized as religious delusion resulting from broodmind contamination. Privately, some inquisitors expressed concern regarding the consistency of symbolic language appearing across unrelated cult populations. Particular attention was given to reports involving wounded Carnifex specimens. Standard Tyranid doctrine suggests that heavily damaged organisms become expendable once battlefield effectiveness drops below acceptable thresholds. Yet several Ordo Xenos investigations documented incidents where surrounding Tyranid swarms displayed unusually aggressive behavior while protecting injured Carnifexes during withdrawal or recovery attempts. One report from a devastated agri-world described gaunt organisms forming dense living barriers around an immobilized Carnifex while reclamation organisms attempted tissue harvesting operations nearby. Imperial forces initially assumed the creature was being abandoned. Instead, the swarm defended the area with extraordinary persistence until evacuation of the damaged organism was completed. This behavior generated speculation regarding possible biomass value prioritization within Tyranid command structures. Some investigators theorize that mature Carnifex strains may contain unusually valuable genetic templates preserved for future Hive fleet adaptation. No consensus exists regarding this interpretation. Several anomaly reports focused on unexplained Carnifex survivability under conditions theoretically incompatible with continued biological function. One heavily restricted case involved a Carnifex exposed directly to sustained plasma reactor detonation during an evacuation denial operation. Initial scans identified complete structural destruction across the upper torso. Yet recovery teams later discovered movement trails extending several kilometers from the blast zone. Fragments recovered afterward displayed ongoing cellular activity despite catastrophic tissue damage. Mechanicus representatives attributed the phenomenon to residual Tyranid regenerative biology. The Inquisition classified the full incident under restricted xenobiological hazard protocols. Additional concern emerged regarding possible synaptic persistence anomalies. Traditional Tyranid understanding holds that most non-synapse organisms degrade behaviorally once disconnected from the Hive Mind network. However, several Carnifex-related encounters appeared inconsistent with expected patterns. In one interrogation transcript, surviving guardsmen described a Carnifex remaining motionless inside a collapsed transit station for nearly 2 standard days following confirmed synapse disruption throughout the surrounding region. The organism resumed movement only when evacuation columns entered the sector. No feeding behavior was observed beforehand. No nearby synapse creatures were detected afterward. This incident remains unresolved. Certain inquisitorial scholars propose that mature Carnifex strains may retain partial autonomous threat recognition capabilities exceeding prior Imperial assumptions. Others warned that such theories risked exaggerating Tyranid intelligence without sufficient evidence. Still, the reports continued accumulating. Beneficial findings associated with Carnifex analysis were comparatively limited but not entirely absent. Several Ordo-Xenos tactical studies concluded that the organism's immense physical aggression occasionally produced exploitable predictability. Carnifexes strongly prioritize structural penetration, direct assault routes, and visible resistance concentrations. Skilled commanders capable of manipulating terrain geometry could sometimes redirect assaults towards sacrificial kill zones or pre-sighted artillery corridors. This strategy proved especially effective when defenders maintained discipline long enough to avoid premature firing. Some inquisitorial tacticians argued that the Carnifex's greatest strength was not physical resilience alone, but the panic generated by its approach. Units trained extensively against Tyranid siege organisms demonstrated significantly improved survival rates compared to inexperienced regiments encountering Carnifex broods for the first time. As a result, several restricted anti-Tyranid training programs incorporated detailed psychological conditioning modules specifically focused on resisting Carnifex-induced morale collapse. Mechanicus collaboration also produced limited advances in anti-monstrosity targeting doctrine. Repeated battlefield dissections identified several vulnerable anatomical junctions beneath major armor plates, particularly around limb articulation regions and lower thoracic segments. Concentrated melter or plasma fire directed precisely into these areas improved neutralization rates considerably. However, successful execution under live combat conditions remained difficult due to the creature's speed, swarm support, and environmental chaos. Detrimental findings greatly outweighed beneficial ones. One major concern involved the apparent acceleration of Carnifex adaptation rates across successive tyrannic conflicts. Ordo-Xenos archives contain comparative imagery, showing increasingly refined armor growth patterns, weapon symbiote integration, and environmental specialization over time. Some Hive fleet strains displayed modifications clearly absent from earlier encounters. This suggested that the Hive Mind continuously improved the Carnifex template using cumulative battlefield feedback. Another deeply troubling finding involved civilian psychological contamination after exposure to Carnifex assaults. Survivors frequently exhibited recurring structural paranoia even years after campaigns ended. Refugees relocated from Tyranid war zones often refused subterranean habitation, enclosed industrial districts, or fortified bunkers due to traumatic associations with breach events. Several planetary governors petitioned the Inquisition for permission to suppress portions of Tyranid battlefield imagery after widespread public morale deterioration followed leaked picked recordings of Carnifex assaults. The requests were quietly approved. Some Ordo-Xenos agents also warned about ideological contamination among certain Imperial populations. On worlds repeatedly threatened by Tyranid invasion, isolated extremist groups occasionally developed fatalistic beliefs centered around the inevitability of biological superiority over mechanical civilization. Carnifex organisms became symbolic within some of these underground movements, representing unstoppable collapse rather than simple alien threat. Most such groups were purged quickly once discovered. Nevertheless, the phenomenon disturbed several inquisitorial observers because it suggested Tyranid warfare could produce long-term cultural destabilization even without successful planetary consumption. Another anomaly involved astropathic impressions associated with major Carnifex assaults. Though not psychers themselves, several astropaths stationed near Tyranid war zones reported intense emotional disturbances immediately preceding large-scale breach operations. Descriptions commonly included sensations of crushing pressure, advancing weight, or unstoppable momentum. Officially, these symptoms were attributed to broader Hive Mind psychic interference. Unofficially, some inquisitors wondered whether concentrated Carnifex deployments generated unusually intense psychic resonance due to the Hive Mind's strategic focus during breakthrough phases. This theory remains speculative. One final category of detrimental findings concerned Imperial over-reliance on static fortification doctrine. The Carnifex consistently demonstrated that sufficiently adapted Tyranid assault organisms could eventually overcome even heavily engineered defensive systems through repeated pressure and biomass expenditure. Several inquisitorial strategists concluded that the organism's true danger lay not in individual combat performance, but in what it revealed about the Hive Mind's long-term philosophy. No defense is considered permanent, no wall is considered absolute. Every structure eventually becomes a biological problem, awaiting the correct biological answer. The Carnifex was one such answer. From the Inquisition's perspective, this realization carried deeply unsettling implications for the future of Imperial warfare. Humanity built fortresses believing strength could preserve civilization indefinitely. The Tyranids approached civilization itself as a solvable structural obstacle, and the Carnifex remained one of the Hive Mind's most efficient solutions ever developed. By the later stages of the Tyrannic conflicts, several factions within the Ordo-Xenos concluded that existing Imperial threat classifications concerning the Carnifex were insufficiently narrow. The organism had long been categorized primarily as a heavy assault bioform, but accumulated battlefield evidence suggested a broader strategic significance. Inquisitorial analysts increasingly argued that the Carnifex should be understood not merely as a dangerous Tyranid organism, but as a recurring indicator of how the Hive Mind studies, pressures, and dismantles organized civilizations over time. This conclusion generated several urgent findings. The first involved adaptation velocity. Earlier Imperial doctrine assumed that Tyranid evolution occurred gradually across large campaign timelines. However, comparative records gathered from multiple Hive fleets revealed increasingly rapid biomorph refinements among Carnifex strains. Armor density changes, improved ranged weapon integration, environmental specialization, altered skeletal reinforcement patterns, and enhanced mobility adaptations appeared within relatively short strategic intervals. Some inquisitorial xenobiologists warned that the Carnifex may function as one of the Hive Mind's primary adaptive siege templates. Because the organism is deployed repeatedly against heavily defended resistance zones, it continuously accumulates battlefield feedback from the most fortified civilizations encountered by the Tyranids. every failed Imperial defense potentially contributes data toward future Carnifex optimization. If this interpretation is correct, then the Imperium is not simply fighting recurring invasions, it is educating the swarm. This realization produced significant concern among several Ordo Xenos strategic councils. Static anti-Tyranid doctrines risk becoming progressively obsolete if the Hive Mind continues refining Carnifex strains specifically against established Imperial defensive habits. A second urgent finding involved infrastructure vulnerability. Inquisitorial studies repeatedly demonstrated that Carnifex assaults disproportionately targeted systems essential for long-term defensive cohesion, rather than simply maximizing immediate casualties. Reactor hubs, transportation arteries, shield generators, ammunition storage sectors, communication relays, and structural support regions received concentrated attacks even when softer population targets remained accessible. This pattern strongly suggested that the Hive Mind understood systemic collapse rather than mere destruction. Some Inquisitors argued that this represented one of the most dangerous aspects of Tyranid warfare. Human civilizations often measure battlefield success through survival percentages and territorial retention. The Tyranids instead appear to evaluate worlds according to functional breakdown. Once logistics, mobility, and communication structures fail, resistance eventually becomes unsustainable regardless of surviving manpower. The Carnifex therefore operates as more than a siege organism. It functions as a civilization destabilizer. Another major warning sign involved morale erosion patterns among experienced anti-Tyranid personnel. Ordo Xenos psychological reviews identified unusually high rates of long-term combat degradation among survivors repeatedly exposed to Carnifex assaults. Unlike ordinary battlefield trauma, these effects frequently centered around the collapse of perceived structural security. Veteran defenders no longer trusted walls, they no longer trusted bunkers, they no longer trusted armored protection. This psychological shift carried dangerous implications for future planetary defense efforts. Entire Imperial military traditions depend upon confidence in fortification systems, armored doctrine, and defensive engineering. The Carnifex systematically undermined that confidence through repeated demonstrations of physical inevitability. Some inquisitorial strategists feared that widespread dissemination of accurate Tyranid siege footage could destabilize civilian faith in Imperial protection itself. As a result, several campaigns involving large-scale Carnifex breaches underwent aggressive information suppression afterward. Another urgent concern centered on synaptic anomaly reports. Though still officially disputed, enough incidents accumulated involving isolated Carnifex persistence that several inquisitorial factions recommended re-evaluation of existing assumptions regarding Tyranid behavioral dependence. Standard doctrine continued maintaining that non-synapse organisms degrade significantly when disconnected from hive mind coordination. Yet field reports repeatedly documented exceptions involving mature Carnifex strains. Some continued assault behavior beyond projected operational limits. Others demonstrated apparent environmental patience inconsistent with simple predatory instinct. A minority even appeared capable of threat prioritization after local synaptic collapse. No definitive conclusion has been reached regarding these anomalies. However, the possibility alone generated serious concern within the Ordo Xenos. If advanced Tyranid assault organisms can retain partial tactical autonomy independent of nearby synapse support, then many current anti-Tyranid battlefield strategies may require complete revision. One particularly alarming inquisitorial warning involved planetary adaptation timelines. Historically, many Imperial governors responded to Tyranid threats by reinforcing walls, hardening fortresses, expanding trench systems, and increasing armored deployment density. While tactically reasonable against most conventional enemies, these responses may inadvertently encourage the Hive Mind to prioritize more advanced Carnifex siege strains during future invasions. In essence, the stronger a civilization's physical defenses become, the more valuable Carnifex adaptation becomes to the swarm. This creates a dangerous strategic cycle. Worlds strengthen fortifications, the Hive Mind responds with heavier assault organisms, defences grow thicker, the Carnifex grows stronger. Some inquisitors quietly questioned whether the Imperium's own defensive philosophy unintentionally accelerates Tyranid's siege evolution. This theory remains politically sensitive. Another warning sign emerged from Genestealer cult investigations conducted prior to Tyranid invasion events. Cult propaganda recovered from several worlds showed increasing symbolic emphasis on destruction through collapse rather than simple extermination. Imagery resembling Carnifex organisms frequently appeared beside depictions of shattered walls, broken cathedrals and ruined hive structures. Ordo-Xenos scholars considered this psychologically revealing. The Carnifex was not feared merely because it killed. It was feared because it invalidated permanence. Even massive structures centuries old could disappear beneath its assault. This symbolic role may partially explain the intense psychological impact associated with Carnifex encounters. The organism does not simply threaten human life. It threatens the assumption that civilization itself can endure through sufficient engineering and military strength. Certain radical inquisitorial factions proposed even darker interpretations. It is believed by some that the Hive Mind intentionally preserves the Carnifex form because prey species psychologically deteriorate faster when confronted by visible unstoppable force rather than distant annihilation. According to this theory, the Carnifex serves as biological propaganda, designed to break resistance before total military defeat becomes necessary. There is no confirmed evidence supporting deliberate psychological engineering at this level, yet the pattern remains difficult to ignore. Where Carnifexes appear, organised resistance frequently collapses faster afterward. Another urgent finding concerned battlefield escalation forecasting. Several Ordo-Xenos analysts concluded that sustained Carnifex deployment often indicates that a Tyranid invasion has passed beyond containment viability. Early-stage infestations may still be isolated. Vanguard organisms may still be purged. Genestealer cults may still be eradicated through planetary cleansing operations. But once mature Carnifex broods begin systematic siege assaults, the Hive fleet has generally committed to full planetary consumption patterns. At that stage, strategic options narrow severely. This assessment remains classified across several segmentums to avoid morale destabilization. Mechanicus' collaboration with the Inquisition produced additional concerns regarding resource asymmetry. Every Carnifex destroyed typically requires significant expenditure of irreplaceable Imperial assets. Specialized anti-armor weapons, elite infantry casualties, damaged infrastructure, and ammunition depletion all accumulate rapidly during prolonged engagements. The Hive Mind, meanwhile, consumes the battlefield afterward. From a purely logistical perspective, this represents one of the most dangerous elements of Tyranid warfare. Human civilizations fight wars by spending resources. Tyranids fight wars by recycling them. The Carnifex embodies this principle perfectly. It destroys defensive systems expensive to build while itself being theoretically replaceable through consumed biomass. Some inquisitorial economists reviewing post-invasion reconstruction costs concluded that even failed Tyranid invasions can economically cripple worlds for generations if Carnifex assault density becomes sufficiently high. The long-term strategic implications remain severe. In conclusion, the Inquisition ultimately viewed the Carnifex as far more than a monstrous battlefield organism. Administratum tacticians recognized its siege utility. Mechanicus scholars recognized its biological efficiency. The Ordo-Xenos recognized something deeper and more troubling. The Carnifex revealed how the Hive Mind thinks about resistance, not emotionally, not symbolically, not ideologically, structurally. A wall is analysed, a weakness is identified, pressure is applied, adaptation follows, collapse becomes inevitable. The Carnifex is one expression of that process, refined across countless invasions and continuously improved through war against intelligent civilizations. Its claws break fortresses, its mass breaks armoured lines, its presence breaks confidence. Most dangerous of all, it demonstrates that the Tyranids are not merely consuming worlds randomly. They are learning how civilizations defend themselves and evolving organisms specifically designed to dismantle those defenses with increasing efficiency. Every Carnifex encountered by the Imperium today may therefore represent not just a current threat, but a prototype for something worse still developing beyond the darkness between galaxies. That possibility remains one of the Order Xena's most heavily guarded fears.